Welcome to Hope Natural Health, the podcast inspiring you to be your best version. Join me, your host, Dr. Erin, naturopathic doctor, dog mom, cancer survivor, and girl boss weekly as we discuss all things health, hormones, and happiness with a little side of this thing called life. Welcome back to the Hope Natural Health podcast, where I try to get you healthy the right way. Last week, we talked about PMS versus PMDD. So if you're curious about this, go back and take a listen. But this week, I'm super excited to have Susan Willson here. She is a Yale-educated Certified Nurse Midwife who has been working with women in all phases of life for 45 years. Her last 2 decades have been spent working with women in menopausal transition. She has a new book out called Making Sense of Menopause, Harnessing the Power and Potency of Your Wisdom Years. And it's a positive reframing of menopause. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So welcome to the show, Susan.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Me too. I'm glad that we could connect. So before we dive in, I think it's important to tell the listeners a little bit more about your background and how you got into your current work.
Well, I've been in women's health for quite a long time. I started out in my college years working with women at Community Crisis Center Women's Clinic in Atlanta, and then went on to become a midwife and started out doing home births and went back and got all the right letters after my name and have been in a variety of settings since then. I've always been interested in other cultures and how they see birth, because I feel like birth traditions tell us a lot about different cultures. And I've, ever since a child, been very interested in that and what connects us as human beings, as opposed to the differences that we like to think about in terms of making them other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how specifically did you get into, really helping women transition into menopause?
Part of that, I think, was just by virtue of the fact of my own aging.
Mm-hmm.
I've been interested in different parts of the whole process as a midwife at different times of my life. And about 20 years ago, I was also going through menopause and finding that as a medical culture, we didn't really have a whole lot to offer women. So I was taking a deep dive in terms of what really was going on in the body, and also what the psychological and emotional needs of women were at that time, not only in their own lives, but in terms of a visit with a care provider, what was really going to serve them best.
Oh, I love that. And that kind of transitions into one of my questions, which is, and I hear this often, and I get asked this a lot by my patients, is why do you think women fear this transition? They fear menopause. And then on the flip side, why shouldn't they fear it?
Well, I think there's several reasons why we do fear it. One being that until recently, it's been a big mystery. We haven't really had a whole lot of information. Even in my mother's generation, women were sometimes being institutionalized because people didn't understand what was happening. They just saw their female loved one acting in ways that they weren't used to seeing her act, and, having certain symptoms. And rather than really digging in to look and see what was going on, they would just choose to put them away. And that was not that long ago, generationally. I think part of it, too, is just like with pregnancy, we tend to tell each other our horror stories rather than, how empowering something might be or the good parts of it. And I believe that's because women are still processing a lot of trauma that they've undergone in the medical system as it is today. And they're needing to talk it out. And that's one of the things that I really noted when I was speaking about the emotional, psychological needs at this point in time. I really created my whole practice around giving women what they could no longer get in a conventional medical visit, which had just turned into 10 minutes and a prescription. It's very important that we be able to tell our stories, because we hear ourselves differently as well. And so many times we identify really strongly with stories that may no longer actually be true for us anymore. So I like to really remind women that, you've got this. I mean, yes, hormonal transitions and changes can be very challenging sometimes, but you did it at puberty and found your feet afterwards, even though at puberty, of course, we don't have much of an ability to step back and look at what's happening in any kind of objective way. Any woman who's ever been pregnant knows that her body doesn't belong to her at that point. You're literally being turned into a different creature that can create a human being from scratch and nurture it and nurse it. And same thing with menopause. This is all part of a continuum that, nature has put in place for us to evolve both ourselves personally and also to evolve the species, because anthropologists found that when women lived past their reproductive years, began to do that it actually furthered the evolution of the human species. They were able to collect more food. They were able to nurture children whose mothers were having to put their resources toward the next child that was coming along. They were able to hold the long view and tell stories, and that woke up a whole different part of the human brain. So, it's something that, while it seems mysterious and we're made to think, oh, this thing is going to be happening to me, I can't avoid it, here it comes. It's all a natural progression, and each stage of our biological lives builds on the one that came before, and our bodies know how to do it. So we really can trust this.
Oh yeah, trust the process. And it really is second puberty all over again.
In a lot of ways it is.
Yep. And it's sad that so many women do fear it. And I think it's because, exactly what you mentioned, there wasn't a lot of help and there wasn't a lot of resource, and it was, all we heard was bad things, and it doesn't have to be bad. And it's super important to point out. Another big thing that happens that I'm not in menopause, so speaking for other people and most of my patient base, but another struggle I see in my clinical experience is the change in libido, or the sex drive. So I know you focus a little bit about this in your book, but how can sex change at midlife, and how can one recreate a good sex life in their middle years? Because this is a huge problem and, complaint that I hear clinically.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to report that sex can be even better after menopause, midlife, and beyond. Things do change a little bit, and there are several reasons for that. Physically, certainly our body is going through a lot of hormonal change, and so our hormones are up and down and all over the place, but we have a lot that we can do to help stabilize that. A lot of your listeners may not be aware that the hormones in our body they're all based on the cholesterol molecule with different little subgroups attached. So they're able to easily turn into each other just by adding on or knocking off one of those little subgroups. So your estrogen can turn into progesterone. Your progesterone can turn back into estrogen. Your stress hormones are very close in the way they're made to progesterone. So I would say that the key thing here, and I'll get a little more into the libido specifically, but the key thing is what level of stress we arrive at menopause in, because the body is always going to prioritize survival over reproduction. And so when we're under stress, the body's always going to make stress hormones first. And if it can't make enough, it's literally going to steal your progesterone and turn it into cortisol, because nature doesn't want you becoming pregnant if you're in a high stress state. So the adrenal glands that make our cortisol, that handle our stress in the body, are supposed to be taking over from the ovaries as they wind down in menopause.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're very stressed and our adrenals can't catch that ball, then you start to see things unravel pretty quickly. And a woman often says to me, well, yeah, I'm stressed, but I'm handling it the way I always have,
Mm-hmm.
Because as women, we're always putting one more thing on our plate. But then I miss a period, and all of a sudden, hot flashes, night sweats, can't sleep, hair's falling out, gaining weight, have no libido. How can just missing a couple of periods make that happen?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is, of course, that it's not just missing a couple of periods. It's that the whole system that's supposed to be there to catch the ball
Mm-hmm.
Isn't there, and things unravel. So the better one can handle their stress, the more stable the hormones will be, and you'll have less of the big swings that tend to affect women's libidos. So, the hormones of reproduction, the estrogen, estradiol, the progesterone that are running the menstrual cycle, are the ones that make you want to go out and make babies and
Mm-hmm.
nurture everything in sight. So as those are starting to calm down a little bit, there is a bit of that hormonal thing. But for most women, more of it has to do with the stress in their lives. And another thing that happens a lot in our culture now is that we tend to live on parallel tracks to our partners.
Mm.
We have different jobs with different schedules, different deadlines, different things we're focusing on, and our time together, when we're in close enough physical proximity to even think about having sex, is usually when we fall into bed at night exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that works much better for men than it does for women, because their brains are wired visually, and they tend to get their relaxation after sex.
Mm-hmm.
For women, we're wired for needing the connection ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
Before we're interested. So for a lot of women, if this is when sex is possible and when it's being asked for, it often just feels like one more thing on their to-do list.
Oh, yeah.
They're exhausted. They just want to go to sleep.
Yep.
But then we're so shamed often as women in this culture, and also often valued by our sexuality. So women start second guessing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They're often getting pressure from their partners. They're feeling somehow less than if they get to this place where, they're not feeling the connection as much. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the biggest things you can do, there are a couple of things you can, if you're exhausted at night and not interested, try having sex at another time of day, or try getting out of your stressful life if you're able to do that, and take a weekend away or something. Get out of the environment that just seems to kind of run itself.
Yeah.
The other thing is that we tend, if we've been in relationships for a long time, both parties, men and women, tend to just, I won't say get bored with each other, but things seem very known.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if we're working in separate tracks with our partners, we often don't even know what the things are that are really occupying their mind. We often tend to, I think, remember people at a certain point in time and kind of keep them there in our minds rather than keeping up. And so I've found that it works really well for people if they just clear out a place on their calendar to just hang out with their partner again. Mm-hmm. And doesn't have to be for sex, but just to do some of the things you used to enjoy doing to kind of catch up to present time with each other. Mm-hmm. Because men are going through midlife as well. They have hormonal changes as well that are very similar. They're not experiencing hot flashes, but in the same way that women's, what we think of as female hormones, I mean, mm-hmm. we all have, men and women have estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, just in different balance. Mm-hmm. And while our estrogens are coming down and our androgens are going up, the opposite is happening for men. It's almost as if, nature is like coming back to square one again. Mm-hmm. When we're children, we're latent, and then nature polarizes us really strongly for the purposes of reproduction. And then when those times are over, we all kind of gravitate a little bit back toward the middle again. And our task is integration. So hanging out with our partner, really getting to know them again, remembering what we loved about them in the first place. And one thing that I think is key is creating some common goals with each other, things you want to work on together, and talking about the changes that each of you are feeling can really help, because men have a lot of pressure also in our culture to be macho. And that's how, why we have all those jokes about men getting a sports car or, a 20-year-old at midlife or something. They're feeling changes as well and feeling that pressure. So sometimes just really talking about it with your partner goes a really long way toward bringing you back together again, making you feel connected in a way that makes you want to have sex. So there are just so many layers to it: physical, emotional, psychological, and cultural, believe it or not.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's not even, in the later years in life, I think a lot of people struggle with libido, period. And they could still be menstruating and have, good hormone production. And these are really good tips to really think about too. And, it doesn't have to be menopause. I hear,
That's
decreased libido all the time. And I think the underlying thing is a big one is, like you mentioned, stress. So,
and, I would say also that I tend to look at libido kind of in the Jungian sense, that we're not just talking about a desire to have sex, but we're really talking about our life force, our interest in life and what sparks us and keeps us interested. And so many of us are just nose to the grindstone in our culture these days. We're just having to work so hard. Everything is moving so fast. We don't have the little islands of quiet and peace that we used to get naturally when the world was moving slower. And so a lot of us just feel beaten down, and we are beginning to lose that spark that makes us interested, curious, and feel alive.
Well, you all have an assignment. Let's reconnect. Block that time out on your calendar and reconnect with the partner. There's something else that you talked about in your book too. It's the role of the wise woman. So I was really intrigued by this. So can you tell me a little bit about this wise woman?
Well, I think that partly where I go with that has to do with the fact that women in the wisdom years are really meant to be evolving culture in a way. We tend to think of menopause in our culture as being a time of loss, but honestly, it's the harvest. It's when you get to pick that juicy fruit and, savor it, and then take the seeds and plant them for the next generation. And I do feel that a lot of the role of women in the wisdom years is to be creating succession in a way, to be mentoring those coming behind us. And I think it's really critical right now when we look at how we're living our lives on devices.
Mm-hmm.
And it really upsets me so much, for instance, if I'm in a restaurant or an airport and see a toddler really trying to get their mother's attention, and the mother is not even aware. She's just glued to the phone. And then you see babies that have their own devices, or screens being used as babysitters, because once again, we move so fast now. Whereas, the young children, their job is to be learning how they connect with nature, to be out there, learning the mysteries and running around. And it's a way kind of our job to follow them and point things out. But I feel like in this generation, my generation was the last one really to grow up without devices. I mean, the internet was just happening when I was about 45. And I remember still getting those AOL things in the mail. And I finally plugged one into the computer just to see what it was. And it took 45 minutes for a page to load. And I thought, this is crazy. Who's going to do this? But now, of course, everything is just lightning fast, and our world has started moving that fast to keep up with it. So if we, as a generation of women in our wisdom years, do not really show children what it is to have presence, to be really present with them, they're not going to know that. And I feel like it's so important that we not let that go. We grew up at a pace that no longer exists. And this is just a personal feeling. I just really feel that we shouldn't lose what we know. We need to pass it on, be present with that, and learn and come to present time, figure out what's authentic for us now. What is the gift that we have that we want to give to our community, our family, to the world? It doesn't have to be anything big. A lot of people just decide to be grandmothers to their family, or other women get involved in community, or become social activists, or start a new business, or, there are a million things. And there is a physiologic reason for that, because our brains are literally being rewired at menopause toward creativity. The estrogens that run the menstrual cycle, as I said, they stimulate the part of the brain that make you want to go out and make babies and nurture everything in sight, and scan men for their genetic potential. And when you see them walk in the door, that sort of thing. But those estrogens are coming down at midlife, and the estrogens that are rising stimulate a very different part of the brain. They're stimulating the creative centers. So that's when we're being impulsed to do these other things, to start that business, dance that dance, write that book, whatever it is that you have inside you that you feel passionate about. And so I think our job as wise women is to pay attention, to really catch up to present time, so that we know what's authentic for us now, because it's not authentic or really appropriate to be stuck in the same places, or interested in all the same things, doing the same things that we were doing in our 20s. And in my book, I've included a process if women are interested and want to follow the breadcrumbs of their own life to see how their identity as a woman got formed, or whose voice was it really that told you you were this or that, figure out what you can let go of now, mourn the things that you didn't have, celebrate the things that you accomplished. Find out what's real for you now, because then as you move forward, you're very clear about what these years are about.
Oh, gosh. Well, I am not afraid of menopause anymore. Not that I wasn't, because I know, because I'm on the clinical side. I know there's a lot of resources and help, and, it can be transitioned to easily, but I hope everyone else that was listening to this is no longer afraid. And I really liked the whole sex drive chat. I think that was valuable for almost everyone. So, Susan, this has been awesome to have you here. I end all of my podcasts with asking all of my guests the same question. So can you share with us your best or favorite health tip?
I've got to say sleep, because it affects everything. So, and it's one of the best things also you can do for yourself in menopause. Create a rhythm, so your body knows what to expect, when to expect it, because then you can conserve energy. But sleep is critical both for your brain to integrate things and to relax. It's really critical for the adrenals to renew themselves at night. And since they're so key to menopause, makes a huge difference if you're, it's important to, just the natural rhythms of the body to head for the barn about 10 or 10:30, because if you stay up much later than that, then your body's got a second wind to stay up and do whatever you're doing. But it's also in a mild form of fight or flight, so you don't get good sleep that way.
Oh yeah,
so
sleep is so important.
Yeah.
That's one thing I have never devalued is my sleep. I was, I'm proud to admit I was in bed by 7:45 last night, and I'm okay with that.
All right.
Yeah, but I'm an early riser, so sleep is so important. Well, Susan, I so appreciate you being here. All of Susan's information is going to be in the show notes. Like I mentioned, she has her book out, Making Sense of Menopause, and that is actually the website where you can find her book. And again, that will be linked in the show notes. But I just want to thank you again for being on the podcast and sharing your wisdom and really taking that fear out of menopause for women, because it is something that is, kind of concerning for a lot of women. So I appreciate you being here, Susan.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, thank you all for listening today, and we will see you all next week.